기자부대, hop on the beat!
JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a series that has had an interesting relationship with English localization. While JoJo's very popular not just in Japan but in countries all over the world, for one reason or another it had a lot of trouble breaking into the English market. Thanks to the well-known copyright concerns with the series and some plain old mishandling, the series' English localization remained in sort of a limbo until around 2015. And even now, when we have a consistently progressing English release, that comes with its own set of issues, and Viz's handling of the manga has received a lot of criticism from fans. As for my thoughts, for now, let's just say they're mixed. I actually feel like I'm a lot more charitable to the state of the localization than some, but at the same time, there are a few standout issues that really drag it down for me, along with the big one that has been affecting the series for years. So in this video, I'd like to go over the history of JoJo's English localization, take a look at the state it's in today, and point out the many issues people have with it. The plans to bring JoJo to the States actually began quite some time ago. The first hints of it started with the English release of Araki's earlier manga, Bao. Viz Media released it through monthly serialized chapters in 1990 to poor sales, later publishing them in 2 volumes in 1995. There were actually plans to bring JoJo over as well under the title The Strange Adventure of JoJo, but after Bao failed to sell, that idea was abandoned. The first piece of JoJo media to make it into English was the Capcom fighting game, releasing under the title JoJo's Venture in arcades and later on the Dreamcast and PlayStation 1, releasing in the States across its multiple versions from 1998 to 2000. This was a lot of people's first ever exposure to JoJo and pretty much paved the way for everything that came after. Right away we can notice the #1 prevailing issue with JoJo's localization, the copyright name changes. Although here, the changes are still relatively minor and more or less use a similar pronunciation to the real name, with the most different one probably being Vanilla Ice's new name. After this, we get the first real hint of trouble with the next JoJo game, which would release on the PlayStation 2, adapting Part 5. The game was shown off at E3 in 2002 and was set for a worldwide release later that year, before being delayed to 2003 and then silently cancelled, only releasing in Japan. It's unknown why exactly this happened, but a common speculation is that it was related to the amount of copyrighted stand names, in particular ones referencing Prince. The US next received DVD releases of the Stardust Crusader OVAs, the only JoJo anime adaptation at the time. They originally released in Japan in 2 batches in 1993 and 2000, adapting select fights from Part 3's story. In the US, they were released in 6 volumes from 2003 to 2005, featuring an English dub and largely the same localized names as the fighting game. Likely based on the fact that everything localized so far came from Part 3, Viz Media began releasing the Stardust Crusaders manga across 16 volumes from 2005 to 2010, skipping over the first 2 parts. In an attempt to smooth this over, the English version does include a brief recap of the necessary history from Phantom Blood, but the total exclusion of it is still pretty strange regardless given how short the first 2 parts are. This release of the manga is also where the localized names start to become pretty bad. Characters like Devo or Oingo and Boingo, who were previously referred to with a similar sounding name, receive entirely new ones. This release also contained bizarre errors, such as Steely Dan mistakenly having his name swapped with Rubber Soul, and on top of that, violence and other content was heavily censored. It's after this point that the series reaches the limbo I described earlier. The manga stopped after the end of Part 3 without moving on to later parts, and the JoJo games that released in the meantime didn't make their way over. I think some of the reason for this may have been what was affecting the series at the time, since a controversy took place in 2008 involving the appearance of the Quran in the OVA, causing Shueisha to halt all OVA and manga shipments of JoJo. This caused the publication of the English release to stall for a year, with Part 3's manga receiving redraws to remove a depiction of the mosque in all future releases. While the manga came back, distribution of the OVA was permanently cancelled, removing one of the main selling points of the series. To this day, the OVA hasn't received any new releases in Japan. This same controversy is what is also believed to be responsible for the now lost 2007 Phantom Blood movie not receiving a home release, which of course means it would never make its way to foreign markets either. JoJo received a renewed popularity with the airing of the 2012 anime adaptation, which turned out to be JoJo's big break into the US. When the Part 3 anime rolled around in 2014, Crunchyroll obtained the streaming license, and for the first time, English-speaking fans were able to actively keep up with JoJo in an official capacity. Shortly after this, in 2015, the manga officially began publication in English, starting with the first part. Since this point, both the anime and manga have continued to steadily release to this day. Now, that is a major breakthrough, and the state of the series in America is perhaps the best it's ever been. But now it's time to move on to the other main topic of the video, the places where the newer localization of the series is really lacking. The previous Viz manga release of Part 3 was published in typical individual volumes, which is how most manga series are handled in English. Starting with the new releases, however, they have instead come out in larger books that combine multiple volumes. This is a common practice for releasing older series, but the version we got is actually based on a special anniversary edition of the manga called JoJonium. This serves as the source of the designs of the covers, including the modern Araki art that we see on the volumes. Now personally, I love Araki's art and I think his modern renditions of the characters are great, but it is quite jarring having the characters on the cover appear entirely different to the manga inside, and this decision turned out to be off-putting for a lot of people. It also just feels odd having what was a special anniversary re-release of the manga now serving as the main format for the only available English release. What's more, the JoJonium release only went up to the end of Part 3, so after that point, the English version was left hanging for a while, eventually returning with a brand new version of Part 4, similarly styled as a hardcover, but this time using the original volume covers that the old releases lacked. I am glad that they decided to try and keep the volumes uniform, but it is still jarring having the covers completely switch from new Araki art to the classic covers, when it may have been more advisable to use the classic covers for the English version to begin with, like how it is with almost every other language's releases. Now, when it comes to the insides of the books, I actually think the first 3 parts are handled really well. Araki's art is presented beautifully, and we even get all of the full color and bichrome pages, which just by themselves make the books worth it for me to own. Now, I can't personally vouch for the quality of the translation since I don't speak Japanese. However, I have spoken with people that do, and the consensus among the community seems to be that the translation itself is good across the board. For my videos, I have to compare multiple versions of the manga, and I often end up discovering mistakes in the fan translation that the original one actually gets right. However, where we start to see some problems is with the presentation of the art and the quality control in the later releases. One common practice when it comes to manga translation is the process of redrawing. Since the manga often has Japanese text laid over it, an effort has to be made to replace the text while preserving the art underneath it. Sometimes while doing this, it's necessary to actually draw new bits of art to fill in the gaps, so that the new text blends seamlessly. We can see this done all the time across both official and fan translations of JoJo. However, once we get to Part 4 in English, we start to see some serious issues. Instead of doing any redrawing for the covers of the chapters, Viz instead opted to plaster a big box on top of the art to contain the title, which ends up getting in the way and covering up the art. And they'll even put these boxes in places where there was no text to begin with for no real reason. These releases are also pretty averse to redrawing outside of that, and even the text within the chapters is often expanded to cover more of the art than it did initially. We do see some redraws, but some of them end up coming out pretty shoddy, especially on the color spreads, where instead of just using the clean version of the art that is already available, it seems like there was a lot of use of Photoshop cloning to cover things up. Take a look at the design of Mista's pants in this spread, or Trish's dress here, where we see some of the mathematical symbols get turned into gibberish. We also have examples of times where no attempt is made to redraw at all, with portions of the art visibly erased and just missing in the final product. The quality control just isn't there, with the new Steel Ball Run release also coming full of typos and bad cloning. Here we can see Japanese text accidentally left behind, a copy of Sandman's mouth floating next to his head, and even mixing up the year the story takes place by writing 1890 as 1980. And this really is a shame, since I think some of the earlier releases were a good effort and the translation itself is great, but it gets dragged down by the presentation and all of this other stuff around it. If we take a look at the credits of the volumes, there actually isn't any kind of dedicated quality checker listed, something that you do see in other manga releases. The errors in the Steel Ball Run release were thankfully addressed in reprints, but the state of the initial version is something I would deem completely unacceptable for a major manga publisher, and I can only hope that it won't be a trend going forward with what is such a long-awaited release. With all that out of the way, I want to fully address the elephant in the room when it comes to JoJo localization, that being the heavily censored names of nearly every character and stand out of precaution for copyright. I already touched on the fact that this issue existed ever since the series' first appearance in English, but over time it has gotten significantly worse. I've been keeping up with every new change in the localization in real time for the past decade, and some of the choices made here are so ridiculous that I am honestly convinced that almost none of them are necessary to begin with. Now, the general idea is supposed to be that the names of songs or musicians are renamed as a precautionary measure to avoid any kind of copyright issues. On its face, I'm actually fine with this, and while it certainly isn't ideal, if it were at least handled consistently, it could be understandable. But it's become clear over the years that whoever is in charge of what is acceptable as a name simply has no clue what they're doing. One of the main ways we can see this is just with the consistency. For example, Jean-Pierre Polnareff is named after the French singer Michel Polnareff. This doesn't seem to be an issue though, and he was called Polnareff across the old games, the OVA release, and the English Part 3 manga. However, for whatever reason, in 2014 he was hilariously renamed to Jean-Pierre Eiffel, despite there apparently having been no issues using the Polnareff name before. And in every piece of JoJo media since, he's gone right back to Polnareff, including the re-release of this game, meaning this bizarre and distracting renaming was seemingly completely pointless. One of the other strange trends comes with stands being renamed or not almost arbitrarily. Almost every stand name starting in Part 4 has undergone some kind of change, since they are almost all named after songs or bands. Strangely enough, however, Rohan's stand Heaven's Door has never been altered in any capacity, despite being explicitly based on the title of a song. At the same time, stands such as Echoes or Surface that are just one-word names that could presumably be gotten away with do get changed. Perhaps the most bizarre type of renaming though are the times where stands are renamed from music references into different music references. For example, the character Jay Guile in Part 3 is named after the Jay Giles Band. In English, however, the character is renamed to Centerfold, which is itself one of the most famous songs from the Jay Giles Band. In what way could it possibly make sense that Centerfold is an acceptable name when not only has the reference practically not been changed at all, but when we have also seen in other examples that single-word names don't get a free pass? For another example, the Part 3 characters Oingo and Boingo are named after the band Oingo Boingo. However, they were renamed to Zenyatta and Mondata, referencing the album Zenyatta Mondata by the band The Police. So presumably, referencing The Police is okay. Well, in Part 4, Koichi's dog is named Police after the band, and that stays the same. Later in Part 8, we have a rock insect named Doo-Doo-Doo-Da-Da-Da after a Police song. But in All-Star Battle R, its name was slightly changed, although not by much. Something pretty interesting is that in Part 7, there was actually a racer named Zenyatta Mondata, with a horse named Roxanne after another Police song. This character never physically appears in the manga and is only named on the scoreboard of the race, but it is a funny example where Araki happened to also reference the same name that was later chosen for a localization. With the newly released Steel Ball Run English version, however, this character's name was also changed, with it now being Zen Monde, and the horse's name being changed to Roxana. Like I've said before, this is just strange. I can go turn on the official English release of the anime and the name Zenyatta Mondata will be there plain as day, but if I open the Part 7 manga, the name is apparently not able to be shown. What's more, while the old manga and anime subs change the names of Oingo and Boingo, the newer manga doesn't, so we actually have their normal names in use now, but only in some places. My favorite, and maybe the single most ridiculous example though, comes from the minor character Kenny G, named after the American jazz musician. However, in both the manga and anime, this character's name is changed to Billie Jean. Now, no offense to Kenny G, but he is not particularly well known, at least not nowadays. But in what way is a copyright scandal being avoided by not just changing the name into another music reference, but into the title of a song from not just one of the most popular musicians of all time, but from the single best-selling album of all time? This also makes even less sense when we get to part 5, when Man in the Mirror, another Michael Jackson reference, is changed just like any other stand name. The enforcement of these names is also wildly inconsistent across releases. I distinctly remember watching Part 4 as it released and seeing the subs from Crunchyroll that entire time, which heavily altered the names of most music references. In the English version of Part 4, Kira's stand Killer Queen is instead referred to as Deadly Queen. However, in the very last episode, the Crunchyroll subtitles mistakenly call the stand Killer Queen. I was actually so wrapped up in the finale back then that I didn't even notice it at first, but it was there, and it has remained there for almost a decade at this point. I already remembered seeing it long after the fact, but I even got a Crunchyroll free trial just to show that it's still there and it was never fixed. And in the very same episode, he still calls the stand Deadly Queen. It gets even weirder when you look at JoJo on Netflix. For the first 3 parts, they use the localized names you would expect, like Bluford, Dan of Steel, Billie Jean, etc. But strangely, once you get to part 4, there isn't a single localized name to be found. Crazy Diamond isn't called Shining Diamond, Echoes isn't called Reverb, and Killer Queen isn't called Deadly Queen. I checked, and as far as I can see, all of the stands use their original names. The episode titles use the altered ones, but that may just be to line up with the English dub, which still uses all the new names. Don't get your hopes up though, since part 5 and 6 on Netflix just go back to using the copyright names again. Although they seem to have given up on Reverb entirely, since Echoes is named correctly here, while the same episode on Crunchyroll is still saying Reverb. I'm sure you see what I mean. We have some versions of the series being super lax with the names with seemingly no consequences, while other versions are super strict with renaming every little thing, even when their process of renaming makes no sense or is full of errors. And across all of this, in the series' entire localization history, no known lawsuit or copyright action has actually ended up taking place, making it seem like this entire exercise was for nothing. This becomes even more ridiculous when we look at other series that use music names which do so without these kind of changes. The Guilty Gear fighting game series is full of direct references to bands and songs, and they don't get changed. In maybe the most egregious example compared to JoJo, we have the manga Bastard Heavy Metal Dark Fantasy, another series that names its characters and locations after bands. One of the kingdoms in the series is named after the band Whitesnake, much like the main villain Poochie's stand in Stone Ocean. In the 2022 anime adaptation, which is licensed by Netflix, we can see that they actually use the name Whitesnake completely uncensored. But if you just click over to part 6, another Netflix exclusive anime, we see Whitesnake censored to Pale Snake. So has there been any official reason given for all of this? Well, there has, but it's sort of been delivered in a weird way. All the way back in 2013, a PR manager of the Viz Media Facebook page actually responded to the copyright concerns in the comments. They said that the series is like a lawyer's nightmare with the amount of blatant references. Keep in mind though, this is from 2013, when only the original English release of Part 3 was out. The comment lists out a bunch of stand names from Part 4 and says that there's a lot of people they have to contact and work with to be able to use the names. However, as we've seen, some of these names like Heaven's Door went completely untouched in localization. Later in 2014, Bandai Namco Europe posted a Polnareff trailer for the upcoming English release of All-Star Battle, where, as I went over before, Polnareff is instead named Jean-Pierre Eiffel. In a comment from the channel, they state that the names are changed due to copyright issues, and that every name is submitted to Araki for approval. Just to be upfront here, I sincerely doubt this is true or that Araki has much of anything to do with the names chosen, especially when it comes to how inconsistent they are. The original release of All-Star Battle in particular is perhaps one of the worst examples of JoJo's localization, with it not only introducing many of the most scrutinized English names, but also with its blatant mistranslation of many of the characters' voice lines, instead replacing them with entirely new ones. These two comments in particular are also very old, and a whole slew of copyright names have been implemented and undone since then. The most recent thing that could give us an idea of what's going on actually comes from a 2021 interview with the artistic director of the French dub of Part 5. They briefly comment on the use of the localized names, since the French dub uses all of the same names as the English one. Here they say that it isn't an issue of the localization team not being able to acquire the rights, but that JoJo's publisher Shueisha is the one withholding the right to use the names outside of Japan. This is a pretty interesting comment, and I am more inclined to believe it since this person is actually involved in the dubbing process, while the other comments just came from social media managers who may or may not know anything. I think this comment is true when it comes to the production of the French dub, but I'm not so sure it goes beyond that. And Shueisha just may be picky about having the names said out loud rather than in written form. After all, if we take a look at the French manga which covered Part 5 in the mid-2000s, it uses all of the original names. And the same is true in the Italian, Spanish, German, and Brazilian Portuguese versions. Also, unlike the French, the German dub still uses the original names without any issues. So once again we see that the whole situation is needlessly confusing and inconsistent. The point of this video is not to simply bash the English versions of JoJo. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is my favorite manga and anime series, and I want nothing more than for it to be spread to more people and continue to grow in popularity. But I think JoJo has been uniquely screwed over in its localization in a way that I don't think a single other manga series can properly match. I've spoken before about my preferences for reading JoJo in its original black and white format with Araki's color pages, something that is even better when done physically, and I have gone far out of my way to collect physical manga of many series to be able to get what I consider to be the most ideal reading experience. So it's very frustrating to have something that is so close to being that ideal experience for my favorite manga of all time, but the various issues with the releases I've described and the shoddy localized names being inescapable make it impossible for me to consider this the best way to read JoJo. Actively paying for something that will not just have the incorrect character names, but also be of lesser quality compared to fan scanlations, I think is a serious blow to the series' credibility for English readers. And like I said, if the names really were a complete necessity, and if their use was handled with any kind of transparency, it might be reconcilable. But when the sheer inconsistency is so apparent, to the point that the supposedly protective renaming undermines its own premise by not actually removing music references, it makes it impossible for me to believe that any of this is actually necessary. We have seen that the vast majority of names can be used without issue, and that really is a shame, especially because there are many great aspects of the localization. The manga includes Araki's original colored illustrations, something that isn't true for many manga releases, and the translation itself is in most cases the most accurate one available. I just hope that in the future, the treatment of the series in English can improve, since I want all potential JoJo fans to get the best possible experience. That's about everything I have to cover today. The amount of changes made to JoJo across languages is pretty huge, so I'm sure that there's a lot I didn't cover and that there'll be more in the future. What I want to know is, what are your thoughts on JoJo's localization, and what are some ways you think it could be improved in the future? I'm interested in seeing what people think, so be sure to let me know in the comments. If you want to stay updated on new videos, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. You can also be notified whenever I upload by joining the Hum and Beat Discord using the link in the description. Finally, I'd appreciate if you help support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. All supporters get their names featured at the end of the video and can submit viewer questions. This video's question comes from Meme Lord. They ask, what is my personal favorite episode from each part? I've answered a similar question in the past when it comes to my favorite fights or arcs in each part, but in this case I want to focus on the anime specifically. For Phantom Blood, I think episode 2 is my favorite since I think it best captures the Victorian era with its locations, and I like how evenly the story is split between Jonathan and Dio, and it has the discovery of the mask's power, which is one of my all-time favorite scenes. For battle tendency, my favorite would come from my favorite Part 2 fight, the 13th episode covering the start of the fight with Wamu. Stardust Crusaders has a lot of great fights to choose from, but I think I'll pick the Oingo Boingo Brothers episode, since not only do I love that arc in the manga, I think it was adapted perfectly here and works great as a standalone episode I find myself rewatching often. For part 4, I'm also picking a standalone episode, the one adapting the fight with the rat stand user. Something unique about this episode is that the animation direction and keyframes are all handled by one animator, Naruhito Sekikawa. This ends up giving the episode a really distinct style, and once again, I find it very easy to rewatch. For part 5, without hesitation, I'm choosing the 10th episode, which gives us a greatly expanded version of the La Squadra backstory, which is completely unique to the anime. Finally, for part 6, I'm going with the finale, which I think did a really great job of capping off the entire anime adaptation up to that point. If you want to submit a question, you can become a patron or member at any tier and submit it in the Patreon community chat or under the members only community post. I try to answer one question per video, so feel free to leave as many as you want since they're all likely to be answered. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons. Thank you to Doorbell, Crayon, RigoVids, Zucato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rayana Meme, Christian McDonough,